Hello and welcome to our Q3 English webinar. I'm Kathy Martin, the Commissioning Editor for English at Collins. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Ali Al-Jamri and Nasima Begum. Nasima is a performance poet, a producer and the trustee of Young Identity, a spoken word and writing collective for young people in Manchester, which runs workshops in a range of arts venues across the city. Nasima's poem was chosen by Ali to be included in our new Key Stage 3 anthology, Who We Are, and we're thrilled to be able to hear the poet reading and discussing her work with Ali today. Ali is a poet and translator who teaches English at the Albion Academy in Salford. Ali is the editor of Between Two Islands, an anthology of poetry from the Bahraini diaspora, and his latest work is currently on display at the Liverpool Arts Festival. So Ali said that growing up, he never saw positive depictions of Southwest Asia and North Africa in his own education. And this has fueled his passion to want to provide a decolonised curriculum, a curriculum that reflects the rich heritages of young people in the UK today. So Nasima and Ali's presentation is going to take about 40 minutes and then we'll have time for a Q&A session taking us to 5 p.m. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat at any point and they'll be answered at the end. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded and let's send a link to the recording after the event. And also everyone who's here today will be entered in a prize draw to win a copy of the anthology for their school. And if you're the lucky winner, we'll be in touch after the event. So I'll now hand over to Ali and I hope you all enjoy what promises to be a wonderful session.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for the wonderful introductions. Yes, so we're here to talk about the Who We Are anthology, and I've got it in front of me because I'm going to be referring to it as I talk about Nasima's poem. And initially, when I got involved, I was very excited because the point of the anthology is to talk about to bring extracts which are perhaps not as represented in the Key Stage 3 curriculum as they should be, and to find extracts which reflect the great diversity of the UK, both racial, sexual, all manners of diversity, ability, disability, all manners of diversity are covered in the book. And we all pulled together, selected, I think we had like 150 extracts that we were choosing from, and then we had to whittle them down to 24. And it was really exciting for me that Nasima's extract was just from So it was very exciting for me to choose Nasima's extract and to see that it got through to the final 24 of the book. Because I think, and Nasima's going to talk about this, it covers a lot of really important things that we don't normally get to hear. It covers both female perspectives and female perspectives on South Asia, and particularly on female perspectives on Bangladesh, particularly, which don't regularly hear and children aren't necessarily exposed to. And it's an important story that they should be. So without further ado, I think I'll pass it over to Nasima now, who I think, would you like to talk a little bit more about the poem? Would you like to read the poem?
Yeah, I can sort of give a brief introduction of the poem. So I actually wrote the poem in 2016. I think it was originally actually for a slam called One Mic Stand in Manchester. That happens every few months. I'm doing the promoting thing, so if anyone's ever in Manchester, get in touch with me. There's always a One Mic Stand on every few months. And yeah, I wrote this poem because at the time, but I suppose a lot of my lifetime, I've had people just mispronouncing my name. It's quite easy to say, it's Nasima, and I've had people mispronouncing my name, and I've always found it really jarring that when you respond to people and say, no, you say it like this, they're still, they just brush it off. And also, like, as well, like in the working world, a lot of my email addresses for a lot of jobs that I've had has been Nasima.Begum, my second name. And or it's at the signature of my email, but still people get it wrong. And I find it really offensive. So I wrote about it. Everything that offends me, all the things that I observe that offend me, I write about it. So yeah, I wrote this poem that I'm going to share with you, if that's okay. My letters have been swallowed and spat out like my phonetics tasted of curdled milk. My exotic is unheard of, unworthy of pronunciation, so you can proceed to commit murder with the way your intonation labels me. Every time I am addressed, I notice a little more the refusal worn heavy on tongues unfamiliar of being demanded to be recognized, regardless of attempts made to stamp me out. I am a force to be reckoned with. My name will bruise your mouth when you say it. So your inadequate attempts made at misreading my S as a Z, because it's easier to enunciate incorrectly, will not suffice. Your language held hostage my name amongst the criminals, but I am a sound your lips had caressed. Intimately, the way you think of me and your men want to adorn me the way your women want to lie naked on my beaches. I am the foreign, unknown territory. All the bitterness forgotten rings bittersweet because I am reminiscent of the stories my foremothers once told of French kisses you pushed down their throats, all so I could embrace your heavy notes. Take your loaded words in case you loaded your gun. I never once realized my name has the ability to knock the fear of God into man, so much that man disregards God and takes matters into his own hands. When all my name connotes is a gentle breeze, but when they turn on me, I am a hurricane no longer tropical. My phenomenal is a dynamite, and you know I will destroy you. I am disguised as the sun, but I know that I belong in winter. When they teach you of diaspora, I wonder if these kings will utter their settling that stole my land and my name to keep in the palm of their hands, but fail to tell you that my thorns still cut them in their sleep. Thank you. That poem's a right mouthful, isn't it?
Wow, thank you. Right, mouthful is one way to describe it. I'd describe it as quite, so it's very impassioned. I had someone say to me, people clapping in the audience, someone say to me, she sounds very angry after I shared the poem once. And I think, yeah, you do sound really angry. I think it's really nice to celebrate that anger because it's also kind of an empowered anger in a way. That's my takeaway. It's like, not only, because sometimes you read something that's just angry. It's not just angry. That's not all that there is to it, but it comes across. It's almost righteous, I would say. And do you want to say, maybe, I've got opinions, but it might be interesting to hear yours first, Nasima. You wrote this back in 2016. You were in a certain place. You were saying about people disregarding your name, people essentially not respecting you. And I guess some of those things come out because, first of all, you chose to title the poem Nasima. You titled the poem after yourself. So kind of it's been 5 years. What still sticks out to you? What are the things that keep you coming back to your own poem?
I think I tried to make a point for myself as an artist not to keep doing that poem because sometimes your work sticks with you. However, I've learned over the last couple of years that it's important that certain pieces of work stick with you. And unfortunately, that will probably stick with me for my lifetime because it still happens. Me and another poet in Manchester have a sort of private joke, but it's not really private anymore, that we're constantly mistaken for each other. She's also another brown woman. We look completely different. She wears a headscarf, but we look completely different. She has 5 children. I have no children. We look completely different. She's Pakistani and Bangladeshi. We're from 2 different countries. We look completely different, yet constantly, you know, and it came up and we laugh about it because it came up in conversation just out of like when we were randomly talking one day about something, but it came up that she had an email from someone, and it was the same person, had an email from someone who said to her, "Oh, Nasima, I saw your poem about your name. It was amazing. And I had an email from the same person saying this monologue on partition and Pakistan." And I'm like, and you know, and your grandma, I didn't know my grandma. So I'm just like, how is it possible to mix up two different stories that are so important, so particular, and so like iconic in our history, and just write them off because like people's brains can't see two different people. And I think I'll continue to be angry about that so long as it still happens. And it still happens. We were at something the other day, weren't we? And it was really annoying me.
Open mic. There were two other women who were hijab wearing and looked nothing like you. And yeah, I think afterwards you told me that someone had come up to you and said, "Oh, that was a great poem." And I think it was before you'd even performed, wasn't it?
Yeah, someone sort of came up to me, and it's instances like this, and it just makes me so angry. So as long as I have those things making me angry, I will keep coming back to the poem, and it will stick to me, and I will, you know, like there's a reason I think that people resonate with the piece so much and ask for me to perform it. There's a reason why it's in the anthology, and I think because it resonates, because it's obviously like a universal thing that happens to brown people, but particularly brown women and Muslim women were constantly dismissed. It's my prerogative actually to be respected and it's my human right. I feel like it's my human right to be addressed as I wish to be addressed, as my name. And it really, like, it's one thing that really winds me up and has always wound me up. So that poem will continue to be a thing, I think.
Yeah, and I think the thing that resonates is definitely the mispronunciation of the name, because if you have a name like Ali or like Nasima, then to you that's the most normal possible name in the world. It's your name. And then to go out in the world and have people who look at your name, squint, are afraid to pronounce it, or are so brazen and just, your name's difficult, I'm not even going to try. It's not. Sometimes names are difficult if, you know, it's from another culture. It happens no matter which culture you're in. There are names that are difficult to pronounce. But if your attitude is, well, that's too difficult, I'm just going to call you Joe, that is disrespectful. And that's something that anyone who lives here who has a vaguely strange name kind of goes through. And I think a lot of people can resonate with that experience on one level. And then also on another level is this idea of like, my name connotes, my name means, that you also mentioned. And I think there's a lot of cultures, it's certainly true of British cultures as well, but there are many cultures where the meaning of the name is so important, and that's something that you're taught early on. You're named this because it means such and such thing. And that kind of relationship with your own name comes under attack when people disrespect it. And it's something that a lot of young people go through. And it's even something that young people experience in school, where they will be, their name might get shortened without them wanting it to. They might want it to be shortened, and of course that's always fine, but they might get nicknamed by peers or by teachers just because they have a difficult name. And it was that experience which I was definitely thinking when I was recommending it to the HarperCollins team. I mean, I think this is important to put in the face of every young girl who has a name that people think other people around them might call weird, which of course are completely normal names. I think I had the pleasure of teaching the poem last week actually, but before, and I kind of want to talk through what it was like actually teaching it and actually putting the lesson plan into practice. So I think, but before that, I think I'll just check in. Is there any other interesting bits of the poem that you think you'd want to raise, Nasima?
It's interesting that you said my name connotes as a gentle breeze, because in Arabic, I'll say it because I don't know if it's in the lesson plan, but in Arabic, the name actually means a gentle breeze. And it's funny because I've literally written a name that is saying, a poem that is saying, I will destroy you. And it's also funny because my dad growing up used to always say to me, you're a tornado. He used to actually call me a tornado, which is quite the opposite of a gentle breeze. And I think the last verse towards the end is, I'm a hurricane, no longer tropical. My phenomenal is a dynamite, and you know I will destroy you. And I think one of the things that I wanted to really like push in that poem was this notion of like, we are what our names are, and my name means gentle breeze, but actually like I stand strong in the woman that I was raised by my parents, and like I really learned to live in my personality and the person that I've become, in the sense that I've all those instances of weaknesses that I started with in the start of that poem, and all those weaknesses that I felt growing up because people were disrespectful with my name, people didn't, people failed to correct themselves, and people continued to just mispronounce it and not give me that prerogative, that human right that I talk about. I feel like growing up is something that I've learned to just live in the strength that I was taught and in the strength of that name. So I think that's quite special. So you were talking about all my name connotes a gentle breeze. I thought it would be important to share that.
And I think as well, the other thing, as you say that came to me, it's another part of the poem, and it's something which excites me even just to, whether or not you get to discuss it with a class, to have that exposed to them, is that it is not a poem that rhymes necessarily, it's free verse. It doesn't use conventional grammar. Okay, in fact, it plays very loosely with grammar at times, and there's a lot of interesting features in it, such as that there's very few capitalized letters, and although you say I a lot, I will, I notice a little more, I am addressed, I am a force. In almost every instance bar one, you've left I uncapitalized. And it's things like that which also just help to expose students to the other potentials that the English language can hold, that how much you can actually play with language, and how, when you've got a strong grasp of the language, actually you can turn it on its head in certain ways. So from both kind of in terms of the message, but also in terms of the form, it gives a lot to dig your teeth into. And actually what I found when teaching it was that we did actually get quite involved discussion about the language and the form, which got quite exciting, I felt, with a year 9 class. I think I will show, I think I'll talk about the lesson plan a little bit now, and then talk through the lesson I actually led. So within the book, which has 24 lessons in it, each lesson has an extract, such as we just heard, which the poems tend to vary up to 2 pages in length. And then there's a 1-page lesson plan that's one example on a random page. And then it will have a 2-page worksheet. So actually that's Nasima's plan, followed by a worksheet and a worksheet overleaf. And then all of the resources are also available online, so that you can download them, and there are easily printable versions. All of the extracts also, we had a lot of conversation. There were, can't remember how many of us in the room involved in whittling these down, but we really went into a lot of depth to think about who's being represented in this book, who and how we can celebrate them. We didn't just want to sit and dwell in, because sometimes when you talk about representation, it will be Asia was colonized, Africans were enslaved. This is diversity, and that's only one part. That's an important thing, but actually we also want to celebrate it's not all trauma. So we went into a lot of thought about all of the lessons to very similar degree to what we're talking about with Nasima's poem. So in writing the lesson then, each lesson includes a learning objective, it has resources. To talk through the lesson quickly, we would hand out copies of the poem. We'd explain a bit of the background about Nasima, being British Bangladeshi, about allusions to British colonialism in India, its consequences for women. We'd introduce personification, metaphor, and irony, because those are the key language techniques at play in the poem. We'd read the poem to the class, pausing afterwards for feedback with guided discussion, and there are a couple of points raised for potentially difficult lines, such as stories my foremothers once told me of French kisses you push down their throats, to explain, to kind of address that line and explore what is that actually saying about violence against women and colonial violence against women. Consider how lazy pronunciation of a person's name is part of that inequality. Then we'd start an activity, just a comprehension activity, drawing out, looking at some of the unusual things about the language, such as what's unusual in the line every time I am addressed? That's the first question. And the answer there is I is uncapitalized. Get them to start thinking about, this is a purposeful thing. This isn't someone's turned off their autocorrect like you might be doing with your WhatsApp. This is a thoughtful exercise. Then we move on through a couple more activities to explore a little bit further the irony, particularly around the name Nasima and a gentle breeze, and to kind of underline that Nasima means gentle breeze. It's suggested to kind of cross out the title and write a new title of A Gentle Breeze, and then read the poem again with that as the title, to kind of embed how the poet uses their ironic name to exert power. And then moving on to, there are two responding questions, two final exercises. One is to write a paragraph kind of exploring irony in further detail, so that they write and we provide the SQI method for that. So writing a clear statement, answering the question, including supportive quotations, and building on those quotations to draw an inference. Of course, other schools will probably have their own frameworks and writing frames to work with. And then lastly, a last activity of writing a poem about your own name. So asking, what does your name mean? Putting a few resources, and it's quite a lengthy activity where quite a few things are put down on how to mind map, to draw out things about your name. If you don't really know what your name means, what can you find out? What can you discover about it? In fact, when I did this exercise with Year 9, there was one boy who said, can you check what my name means online? And when I looked it up, it is an Albanian name. And while there's databases for names from across the world, his name didn't come up on Google, any meaning for it. I actually said, well, have you ever met someone with your name? And he said, no. And I said, well, that kind of makes you unique. Isn't that quite nice that no one else shares your name? How do you feel about that? And actually he was able to then draw something out of that. So we have 4 activities. I'm gonna share my screen to quickly run through the lesson as we did it, because of course with a lesson plan like this, it's best made for adaptation. So I tried to fit this into where my Year 9s were. And actually, in my school, I don't teach Year 9s, so an English teacher very kindly allowed me to guest teach this lesson. The Year 9s study a scheme of work centered around feminist work, centered around Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Are All Feminists. So they are already learning about feminism and learning about it with Global South texts. So Nasima, despite being a poem, they're looking at nonfiction, actually fit very well in with what they're already learning. They're already learning about the patriarchy, about feminism. These are big ideas which are coming up in what they're currently learning. So we found a way to then slot Nasima quite easily into that thematic scheme of work, despite it being a poem. So we started with a do now to settle them in. Normally we ask 5 questions, we ask 3 questions because it's a bit different, just to get them focusing around how do they feel about poetry, because they haven't thought about it yet. Asking them to identify the meanings of objectify and irony, because we know that these are going to come up. Setting out our objectives. Now, the objectives, I kind of summarized them, analyze the poem's language. That's one of the objectives in the lesson plan. Write our own poem. That's one of the lesson plan objectives. Consider how the poem relates to feminism. That's not in the learning objectives in the book, but related directly to what they were learning. Then we included a bit of context. Because we only had one lesson, which is an hour long, we had to be very brief. So I tried to be as brief as possible to explain about British colonialism, and particularly how women suffered violence under the British. Now, depending on where they are in the year, we might go into more or less detail. Also, depending on what they've learned in history, might be comfortable to talk more about that. If it's towards the end of the year, maybe more open about talking about some of these ideas of sexual violence as well than at the start of the year. But for now, I thought this was enough to get them thinking about colonialism and violence against women. We read the poem once, then we listened to a performance of Nasima's poem, which is referred to in the lesson plan, and just searching Black Gold Arts, Nasima Begum comes up. I think it's an older version of the text, but actually got through a lot of the energy and a lot of the angry energy of the poem. We then added some discussion points around Nasima's identity, women's rights, and women's powers. This is the first exercise in the worksheet. I put it up as questions on a PowerPoint, then collecting the similes, metaphors, and personifications. So this so far is just following everything in that worksheet and that lesson plan that I've discussed, but making it in a way that familiar to our students. And then we kind of spent as much time as we could on writing the poem. And because we've got a creative writing club, we then directed them to come to creative writing club to complete their poems. What I found very interesting, and we just had a few more slides around like how to get started and sharing. I will stop sharing that for now. So it was quite a straightforward method of bringing together all of the things that are in the lesson plan, but making it fit for the context of my school, and was relatively straightforward to do, quite straightforward to do. And then what I found when doing the lesson, what energized me was that I noticed that there were 4 or 5 girls in particular who have names that might be comparable to Nasima's, who were actually the most engaged. So girls from minority ethnic backgrounds, who are also very aware of the meaning of their names, whether they were from Afro-Caribbean or Asian or elsewhere backgrounds. They were very aware of what their names meant and of themselves as young women. They were the ones who engaged the most keenly on the poem, but also we saw that everybody was engaging. And while it was a bit of a challenging poem and it took some time to fully comprehend the meanings of it, we found that there was a lot of success through those comprehension questions. I think we got one of the most interesting ideas that came up was because, as I mentioned, almost every instance of I is uncapitalized in Nasima's poem, except for one reference, which is when Nasima says, "I will destroy you." And so there was a lot of discussion of, well, perhaps, the uncapitalized I suggests being in a place of weakness, and actually, "I will destroy you." At that moment, that's when she becomes a capital I, that's when she's at her greatest strength in the poem. And that was something that they were kind of drawing that conclusion, that the lesson plan kind of points them towards that conclusion, but they really drew that themselves. There was another point made that I think the fear of God in man, putting the fear of God in man, and God is capitalized, but man isn't, where you might normally capitalize man. And someone pointed out, oh, shouldn't that have been normally capitalized as that, because man is being put in their place in that particular line, which was an idea that I hadn't even seen teaching it. So it was very encouraging to see the debates. There were things that I might have done differently as well. It was only the first time I ran it. I would have certainly tried to stretch it over 2 lessons. We couldn't do a full paragraph response to the irony because we only had 1 lesson. But what we found was that there was a lot of engagement around the ideas, and particularly around these ideas of both of violence against women and actually the empowerment of women. We weren't sitting in the trauma, we were really sitting in the rising above, the empowerment over it, and also in the context of colonialism and post-colonialism, how this still affects you even today after independence as someone living and growing up in the UK. I'm very conscious I've talked for a very long time, so I think I'm going to catch a breath there. But yeah, it was a very enjoyable lesson to teach, is what I would say there.
It's such a joy to hear it being taught. I think I just need to pinch myself, because I think, not because it's me and it's my work in this piece, which is obviously like something brilliant anyway, and great, but also because it's that particular piece that's in, and you know, that thing that you just said there about a few young people really resonating with the piece, and particularly girls from minority ethnic backgrounds resonating with the piece, is really nice, because I think what I would have liked at school in English literature, in poetry, was to maybe see some texts that resonate with me a little bit more. And I think it's nice that it's brilliant that HarperCollins have put together this anthology with such diverse voices, such different stories, and such current stories that these children, these young people can relate to, can see themselves in. And I think in a country where you are a minority, but you're part of the global majority, it's hard to place yourself. Like, I've always found it hard to place myself, and I've always, like, a lot of my writing is a search for belonging, is a look and observance at identity and what those things mean to me in so many different forms. I write about spirituality, I write about, obviously, like, you know, my identity and so many different things, but I think it's a search for me trying to place myself somewhere. And it would have been nice for me to find a place when I was about 12 or 13, 11, at that age, you know, in writing, because I think it's important that we're reflected, the society that is reflected in the literature, and is reflected in the literature that we're studying as well. And also, it's deeper than that. The conversations, I guess, are about, like, colonization, and then about the aftermath of colonization, about the aftermath of British rule in places like, you know, Africa, in Asia, in South Asia, and it's about really taking back ownership and belonging of our places, and of our place here as well, in the UK. So it makes me feel really happy.
I think that's great. And one of the things that I realized as well on doing this is that we have this very sensible but unfortunate thing that Asian History Month is in August, which of course means that students, it doesn't coincide with the school year. And it's that month because it relates to partition, doesn't it? but it also means that we don't have that dedicated month where you can push Asian arts, Asian literature, Asian history to schools in the same way that you can during Black History Month, during Pride Month, for example, where we can make that a school's focus. Unfortunately, it falls out of the school calendar. So for me, it was also quite, well, quite good to know as a teacher that I can actually bring, help fill in gaps that might exist in the curriculum through poems like yours and some of the other texts in the book, to give them a different experience of Asia, because even if we don't necessarily go into it in as much depth as it might deserve, depending on how much time we have to give to it, whether it's one lesson or multiple lessons, yet to expose them to a South Asian writer, a female South Asian writer, a female South Asian writer from Bangladesh. How often will that come up for students? Very rarely. And so it opens up, it helps to open up questions that can be asked about those other histories of Asia as well. So the histories of partition as well, and how widespread was British colonialism and how violently it ended. These things are hinted at in the poem as well, and there are things that can be drawn out of.
I think, like, obviously it's great after so long that a South Asian History Month exists and Black History Month exists, but we need to really think about beyond a month. We need to think about pinpointing on things when they happen, like, of course, last summer, when the horrific incident that took place in America and George Floyd was murdered. We need to stop thinking about, we need to always be angry, and we can only always be angry about these wrongdoings and these injustices if young people are able to talk about them in a safe way, in a safe manner. And I think that will help undo a lot of the issues around race and the issues around Islamophobia and the issues around, I guess, discrimination as a whole, when we're able to talk about it and we're not censored in our schools. And I think we are censored in our schools a lot. We're censored with what we can teach. And again, another really important reason why, this piece is in the anthology and all the other wonderful pieces that are in it as well, because colonization happened in this time where none of us, we weren't there. Our ancestors felt and died and bled, and all of these things happened to them. But we're living with the sort of unspoken intergenerational trauma of all of these things that we didn't really get to speak about. We don't get to talk about this trauma, this war, and this continuing war, across many parts. And I think it's not, 1 month isn't ever going to be enough. One lesson isn't ever going to be enough, and it's so important to talk about this stuff to young people, and for them to feel comfortable in who they are, and for them to learn about who they are, and for them to feel a sense of belonging in a place that often we don't feel a sense of belonging.
I absolutely agree, and I think one of the takeaways for me with this book, with other books like it, is once you have these, when I look at this, sometimes I think, well, that's not what a lesson plan looks like in my school, so I need to think about how to. But once I've done that once, I can then reuse that again and again, and I can roll that out, and I can start to think more clearly about how it can be incorporated. So in Year 9, our students learn, we've got our feminism scheme of work centered around We Are All Feminists. We've got a poetry scheme of work, which is centered around relationship poetry. I'd argue that this is a relationship poem. It's very easy to argue it as a conflict poem. So if you're looking at conflict poetry and thinking ahead about what they're going to be studying in GCSEs, for example, that's something that that can be done quite easily. Just getting feedback there. So each of these poems, and not just poems, there's also short stories, there are extracts, there is non-fiction as well. And we have tried to pick ones which might be quite challenging for our understanding of things. So if I look at the contents page, we've got things like David Olusogun, Black and British, a short essential history, Verizzo from A Guide to Being Black. We've got Nasima's poem, we've got Raymond Antrobus's Echo, which is about deafness and childhood deafness. Amrul Qadi, an extract from Life as a Unicorn, which is, and they are a non-binary drag queen. So having extracts from these aspects, which you might not typically see in the curriculum, in the set readings and so on, it's wonderful, but it also is something that can easily be added to a lesson plan, to a scheme of work, and filtered throughout. It's not just used as a one-off thing of let's do something special and diverse, but actually, well, how does this work within a larger scheme of work around relationship poetry? Because it's a relationship, it's about rejecting forcible relationships and patriarchal and oppressive and colonial relationships, and it's about celebrating one's relationship with their self, with oneself, and with one's and I love this word that you use in the poem, with one's foremothers. The idea of what does it mean to celebrate our foremothers rather than using the much more normalized, much more usual forefathers. So there's so much that is there, and that can be used in a lot of spaces within a school curriculum.
It was really important for me to use that that term, because often, like, history is a constant repetition of itself, but often in that repetition, it's the minorities within the minorities, it's their stories that we lose, but particularly the stories of women. Those stories of women are not ever well documented, they're not ever well told, and we never get to hear about it from them, from women's voices. We never get to hear about it from women. They're often changed. And I think, like, for me, writing that word, you know, my sister, in fact, always says to me, like, that doesn't even make sense to say foremothers. And I've explained it to her a couple of times. She's like, yeah, I get it, but like, we're just so used to using forefathers and saying man and mankind and things like that. And I want to change that language. I want to change the dependency on language that is created, you know, that is conditioned for us to rely on patriarchy, to rely on men. Like, why do we need to rely on the patriarchy? We don't need it. And it's because we've relied on the patriarchy. It's because the patriarchy has conditioned us to think in a certain way, to speak in a certain way, to breathe in a certain way, that again is part of the issue. And it's only when we unlearn those things and we change our language, we change the way that we think, and we change the way that we talk about these issues, that's when we'll feel better. So it makes me feel better. It made me really feel better to use that word, and it's such an important word.
Absolutely. And I think looking back, I almost wonder why I didn't make that one of the lesson kind of activities, like really unpicking that. And certainly if I were, and I, when I'm teaching Year 9 again, if I use the poem, and when I do use the poem, it's something that I know that they're studying feminism. So I know they're already thinking about patriarchy, objectification. These are all parts of what they're learning about. How does foremothers just turn that all on its head? And it's such a clever use of language. Now, we're coming up to 4:45. We have hit 4:45. So I think we were going to take questions. If anyone would like to ask questions, to put them in the chat. I think we'll be able to see them come in as they do. why do we recommend teaching this to Year 9 specifically? So I think we had a bit of a discussion about this, in fact, within the team as we were writing it, because initially I had suggested it was a Year 8 poem, and that I think was where we were aiming for. I think what we flagged up, one of the things was that there are these references to not just to violence, but to sexual violence against women. And while it's not the most explicit you might find in a text, I think it's forcing French kisses you push down their throats, and one or two other references like that made us think this sits more comfortably with Year 9, where the children are a bit older, they are a bit more aware of sex as a thing. They'll probably have had more exposure to it within the curriculum in a mature way, and will be more able to actually discuss it. Whereas if we're doing it in Year 8, we might have to think about, well, kind of just papering over it, especially if it's at the start of Year 8 and they're still more childlike than they are teen-like. So I think that was a big part. But I think as we look at it in Year 9, there are a lot of ways that the poem can be taken, whether as, you know, talking about colonialism, talking about patriarchy, talking about gender, talking about identity, that the lesson plan, in a way, is almost there as a mere suggestion, because you might think, well, yeah, that's all well and nice, but actually, this is a really interesting aspect of the poem that the lesson plan is completely missed and works really well with the scheme of work. I think Year 9 allows for that more than others. And then also why Year 9 over GCSE is, of course, because some of Key Stage 3 just allows for a bit more freedom and looking at things a bit more loosely compared to GCSE years, where you are always thinking about, well, how does this fit back with what they need to do when they're sitting their exams? Okay, so Kathy is asking, could you both say a bit about how you make your teaching more inclusive and more representative, not just what you teach, but how you teach in the classroom? And I feel I've talked a lot, so I'm going to bounce this to you, Nasima. And I know, because you also do workshops in school as well. So this is, although you're not a teacher, this is something that you think about in terms of how you, like, what your work with young people. So how do you think about that with, like, colonizing their engagement with poetry?
When I sort of run workshops with young people, or like I teach workshops from, I have taught workshops from as little as 6 to as old as like 60. And I think like my most important when I'm brought in on a project is to think about text to look at. I think about text, I don't know what people have read or haven't read, right? But text that I think would be a good spark of conversation and a good theme of, so a lot of my work is around sort of like activism, identity, and I want my work to be a point of thinking, a point of dialogue. So when I sort of think about text to sort of bring into workshops, I think about conversation. What could I talk about in this poem and in this piece that will then bring about really good conversation and pull out really, really good themes that we can then, that we don't maybe get to experience, or we might not know of that experience, but also be able to write about those experiences and be able to think about those experiences, but from our own comparisons of what those things may be. So recently, like I looked at a poem called Anti-Biography by Muhammad al-Kurd, who some of you may know, but he's a Palestinian poet who I think is based in America, but he's from Shahshara. He's from Shahshara in Palestine, who, if you sort of follow what goes on in Palestine, there's sort of Shahshara is currently sort of being taken over. A lot of it is being, you know, is settled in by Israeli settlers. Anyway, that's another political discussion, but I think it's important to sort of widen our eyes and widen just widen our conversations, because writing is a part of resistance, and it's a part of that. It's a part of documentation. It's part of journalism. Poetry is a part of journalism and documentation. So I guess just I pick based on what I think is important and timely. And sometimes it doesn't mean it's a contemporary poet. Sometimes I don't look at, you know, Mohammed Al-Qura's work. Sometimes I look at Elizabeth Bishop. Sometimes I look at like things that are a lot older, things that are a lot not to do with me, but are absolutely everything to do with me. And yeah, like, yeah, I think that's how I try and be representative. And I try and read a lot. It's really important if we're teaching and if we're writing, if we're creating, is read a lot. Read as many books as I can, and just read to find things that inspire me to take into spaces and teach. How about yourself?
For me, there's a lot to be said about trying to find texts from places that students haven't seen before. And I try to fit as much work and translation as possible, because my perspective is once it's been translated into English as part of the English canon, and therefore, you know, something worthy of analysis in an English classroom. So the curriculum doesn't always allow for that. So I try to, but wherever it does, I try to fit that in. And that's always my first port, of course. Even before a poem written about one's identity in English, I'll think, well, can I find one that's originally been written in Bangla, for instance? And I can't always. Being bilingual in Arabic, I'm lucky to be able to bring that into the classroom and find texts which have been translated and which I'm aware of, or drawing from texts by the Poetry Translation Centre or the Stephen Spender Trust. But that is usually my way of thinking, well, how do I expose them to another world? If I can't do it within a lesson, how do I say, well, if you've enjoyed this, if this is interesting to you, here's, you know, we're studying Dracula at the moment in one of my classes, here's Gothic literature from around the world as well. Here's Gothic literature from India, for example. So that's my go-to method, I think, is always thinking about what can I bring from somewhere that they might not even be able to point at the map yet. And I think you can see my global literature kind of growing display board, which will one day be a bit too filled up with texts to interest them. Stephanie was asking, could the poems in the anthology be used for unseen poetry in Key Stage 4? And Joe Underhair has actually already said that we're thinking of teaching this as an unseen poem alongside Sujata Bhatt's petition and Imtiaz Darkar's honor killing. So that's something gratifying, I'm sure, for you, Nasima. I think yes, you can. I was actually just having a quick flick through of the text as you asked that. I think about 1/3 of the book is poems, roughly. And most of the poems, bar one, are a maximum of a page and a half, and that's A4 pages. The only one that's longer than a page and a half is Echo by Raymond Antrobus, which would not make it very friendly for unseen poetry, because that's longer than even the long poem would normally be in a GCSE. But most of them would probably fit as the long poem that can be used within comparative analysis of unseen poetry, certainly, and particularly within conflict. And there are other great poems in the book, such as, so we've got one by Imtiaz Darkar, Campsie Fells. We've got one by Amina Atiq, who's a Liverpudlian Arab, Scouse Arab poet, A Letter to My Mother. I think a Polish poet, Wisława Szymborska, who's got a poem called Teenager, which would probably make a good kind of relationships themed poem. It's an older person comparing herself to talking about imagining a conversation with her teenage self. So probably a good comparison to something like, is it When I Am Old, I Will Wear Purple? I can't remember the name of the title of the poem. But if you're using that in unseen poetry, this is a poem that fits quite well with that, for example. And there is a key stage for anthology in the works, as has just been put in the chat as well. So there will be more that can be utilized. And the key stage 4 anthology, certainly a lot of these can be used for key stage 4, particularly the year 9 text, but the key stage 4 anthology has also been thought about. We have thought about assessment objectives and the GCSEs, obviously, in picking text. So we've thought about text which would work, for example, as language analysis and practicing language paper, for example. Possibly, I can't remember now. It's a poem that I studied when I was doing GCSE, and I've forgotten the name and I've forgotten most of the words, but the ideas just stuck with me ever since.
I think it is, if it's the right poem. I love that poem.
I think we're coming towards the end. Are there any last questions? Because if not, I think I will probably pass it over to back to Kathy for some final words, possibly about the text.
Yeah, thank you both so much for an absolutely fascinating session this afternoon. You know, we found it so enjoyable here. So I think we're going to be making the lesson available to everyone that's attended or signed up for the session today. And is there anything else? And my colleague Sarah is going to put a link to the webpage so you can find out more about the pack from there. So yeah, just like to say a huge thank you to Ali and Nasima for a brilliant session this afternoon.
Thank you, Kathy, for having us as well. It's been a real pleasure to talk about the lesson.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Apologies for the trains that are going past. I'm in a busy office, that isn't mine. But yeah, it's been a really good conversation.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.